Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I'm going to be talking about what I am currently reading and what I've read in the last week. So I just have two quick things to talk about today, and I'll start with the book that I finished. So I just finished last night reading Oscar and Lucinda. This is a bind up of two books by Peter Carey, but I just read the first book. And Oscar and Lucinda, what do I want to say this book is about now that I've read it? I would say it is about the two titular characters, Oscar and Lucinda, and how their lives cross paths or even collide in some ways, and how that affects both their lives. In amidst all of this, this story is also about expectations, desires, passions, and just sort of going against the grain. A lot of the themes that are talked about in this book heavily surround the idea of the conflict between like man in society or woman in society, as the case may be. There is really also in this story a very strong idea of just finding and figuring out where you belong. In some ways, it almost feels like a Bildungsroman or a coming of age story. So there is that aspect to this story as well. There were quite a few highs in this book for me, but three that I want to focus on are the ones that I'm going to talk about. One would be the writing style itself. I really found Peter Carey in this book to have just a very fluid writing style, one that kind of drew you in and kept you engaged, even if there wasn't a lot of action happening. I would definitely say this is a character based story, so the writing was, to me, very important in terms of keeping me interested in the characters and in the story, even when there wasn't a lot of action happening. I think he makes really good use of metaphors and similes and just has a lot of really enjoyable literary elements throughout the book. So, in that sense, I can see why this book in particular won the Booker Prize. Another high point in this story for me was the way Peter Carey used the themes, and most particularly how he used repetition and symbolism to highlight the themes in this book, especially the themes around passion and expectations and desire. I love how he incorporated the symbolism of the Victorian time period of being constricted or laced or sort of in some way contained within your clothing as a way of talking about how people in this book felt also contained in their passions and like just in their interior life. A low in this book for me occurred somewhere in the middle of the book. For a very short period of time, the book just felt like plot wise and story wise, it was just starting to be dragged out just a little too long and became a little too slow paced, or that the plot itself just really wasn't moving along in the way it had been up to that point, or the way the story was indicating it was going to. So I do feel like there was a little bit of a lag in the middle of the story. The book is 500 pages long, and that lag did make it start to feel like, oh my gosh, the story's never going to end. However, I was able to push through just by shortening the amount of time I was reading it in one sitting, and that got me through that. And it didn't actually turn out to be a very long chunk of the book. I'd say out of the 500 pages, it was maybe just maybe a 50-page chunk that felt kind of too slow. And then you kind of got over it. And then I would say at that point, the plot really picked up because you were very close to the climax of the book. And I would say the way this book ended was just shocking and mind blowing and so fascinating, and really faster paced than the rest of the book. So it was definitely worth getting through that slow point to make it to the end. I ended up giving this book 4 stars as its rating. I think this is a book that I would recommend to anyone who doesn't mind a slower or mid paced character study. I would also recommend it to people who like books that explore the topic of like man versus society or woman versus society as a major conflict in the book, and even that being part of the internal conflict in terms of dealing with one's own expectations of self. It also has to do with gender roles during the Victorian period. So if that's something that's interesting to you, you might enjoy this book for that reason. Finally, I feel like this is a story that is largely about what happens when a stranger comes into town, if you will, and really shakes things up. The next book I have to talk about is Warbreaker. This is a book that I am currently still reading, and I started it and it's going well. I would say that this book is about two kingdoms that are tentatively at peace with one another. They've been in conflict with one another in the past. Now one is sort of a slightly weaker kingdom compared to the other. The story is also about two sisters, one of whom's promised to the king of the other nation, and what happens when their expected and intended roles kind of get reversed. So, in a lot of ways, this book has themes in it in terms of expectations and role reversals that I found similar to the themes in Oscar and Lucinda. And I thought that was an interesting crossover. More than anything, however, I would say that Warbreaker to me is a book full of political intrigue. This is a work of fantasy, and I have heard a lot about this book as well as about Brandon Sanderson's writing in general. And my initial thoughts on this are I can see why people like Brandon Sanderson and why he has mass appeal. His writing style is very easy to read. I would say the book is very well paced. It kind of just continues to move along. However, for me personally, I'm finding it just okay so far. I'm almost done with the book, so I'm hoping to finish it in the next day or two. I will definitely have finished it before November is over. However, it's just not as gripping as I expected. And I'll be honest, a lot of that is just has to do with me personally. Based on what I had heard about the synopsis of this book, I went in expecting this to be more of an adventure rescue story. And what I am finding is that it's not so much a story about someone going on a journey and having an adventure, though in a loose way it is, but overwhelmingly so. I would say this book is about court politics. And as that trope tends to work out in fantasy. And unfortunately for me, that's not a trope that I tend to enjoy that much. I don't tend to be that invested in court politics of a made up kingdom or world. And I realize that that's just a personal preference. So I don't think it has anything to do with the way that it's written in this book. I think it's pretty well done. I think compared to other books that I've read that are fantasy that deal with court politics, like I don't feel like this is in any way particularly unique, but I don't think it's poorly done. So I don't feel like that's something that I can comment on super well because I tend to avoid books that have that as a major theme if I know that's the case, particularly in the area of fantasy. So unfortunately for me, I'm predicting that this is going to probably land somewhere between a 3 or 4 star as the rating, which I know will probably be an unpopular opinion. But again, I guess we have to wait and see until I finish the book. And even then, if I'm honest, I would take my rating on that with a grain of salt because, like I said, I just don't tend to be into political intrigue in fantasy novels. So that's it. Somehow, since my last wrap up, that's all I've read. I mean, I guess it's not really true. I did finish my reading in The Mysteries of Paris, but again, I think some of what happened to me this week was I wasn't super invested in either of the books that I was reading. Oscar and Lucinda was good, but was pretty slow paced. And Warbreaker, I've mainly been listening to on audiobook, but I'm just finding it okay. So I'm really only picking that up when I have time to listen to an audiobook. So we'll see how things go now that Warbreaker is the one that I'm going to try and finish. I don't know if I will be able to fit in another book before my monthly wrap up video. So if I start a book and I don't finish it, I'll probably just take that book and talk about it when I start talking about my December books. But we'll see. Anyway, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel so you can hear my final thoughts on Warbreaker and the other things that I'm reading. And let me know what you have been reading and working on in this last week. And I'll talk to you next time. Bye.